From the unique diets of these Nordic warriors to the traditions and daily routines of the ancient Scandinavians, today we look at what it was like to be a Viking. Number 10. Longhouse feasts. In the Viking Age, the Scandinavian population built their settlements around the iconic Viking longhouse. These long, narrow, timber-framed structures would reach up to 250 feet in length and acted as the centerpiece of a Viking's farm, housing the family in its central hall, as other rooms in the house may serve as stables, tool storage areas, or craftsman shops. While Viking farmers enjoyed using them in everyday life, these longhouses would become especially handy during times of great feasts, when all members of the family could easily fit under one roof to enjoy a hearty and festive meal. Number 9. Beloved mead. During the time of the Vikings, water wasn't always the safest choice to drink. Thus, a new beverage became the common refreshment of choice in the form of mead. This libation is the oldest alcoholic drink known to man, and it was produced by fermenting honey, water, and spices to create a liquid both rich in sweetness and rich in alcohol content. But mead didn't originate with the Vikings, as evidence found throughout Europe and Asia dated back more than 10,000 years. Still, few cultures showed more fondness for the ancient booze than the Vikings, who had entire buildings devoted to its consumption, rightly referred to as mead halls. In order to cultivate this beloved beverage, the villagers of the Viking Age had to attain honey constantly, which gave birth to early beekeepers who would use a coiled dome of straw to house the insects. Unfortunately, the only way to extract the honey using this method involved exterminating the bee colony in the process. Mead, however, was a drink for everyone of all social statuses, so the demand was always high for the drink. As for drinking mead from a horn, like many Vikings are portrayed, this tradition was reserved only for those with high enough status to afford it. Number 8. Hooved delicacies. Massive, strong, and intimidating, Vikings were testosterone-fueled warriors that seemed to tower over their enemies. Such hardy men and women didn't arise solely from genetics, though, as their diets during this period relied heavily on large doses of protein. No matter the social status, Vikings could always rely on a healthy portion of meat on the table come mealtime. Pork made up a good chunk of their daily diets, but these ancient people didn't mind turning to a number of other cloven animals for nourishment. Goat, lamb, elk, reindeer, and horse all provided meat for the people of this era, most of the time prepared through boiling. A common dish in Viking culture called kses is a stew made of whichever of these meats were available, alongside any of their regional fruits and vegetables including carrots, cabbage, apples, herbs, and beans. But perhaps the strangest dish eaten among Vikings is the haukark, a meal made from fermenting shark, left underground for weeks on end prior to serving. Number 7. Bardic tradition. As the mead flowed rampant and the savory meats tickled the tongues of Vikings during times of celebration, people of this Nordic culture would turn to the fire and gather around for the tradition of epic storytelling. This responsibility of recounting tales was left to the skald, a Scandinavian poet that would specialize in Old Norse and Eddic poetry, reading and recounting them before leaders of the Viking era. Eddic poetry came from the Edda, a 13th century Icelandic literature separated into two parts, the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda. This compound collection not only provided budding skalds with stories and poems for their cultural heroes and myths, but also instruction and structure for forming poetry. These poets would also typically detail historical events or praise a patron which they serve, similar to a medieval bard or herald. However, unlike the bard, there has been no evidence found to suggest that skalds used instruments. Some historians, though, have speculated that they might have used the lyre or harp. Number 6. Rune writing. The ancient Vikings are often portrayed as a warrior race, but these people had just as much brains as they did brawn. One of their most iconic achievements as a culture was creating the Futhark, a runic alphabet. Using 24 letters, this written language was used to spell out Germanic languages, and stone slabs throughout Northern Europe host these markings today. This runic alphabet has been divided into two parts, designated as the Elder Futhark and the Younger Futhark. The former is the original and oldest form of the written language, and was used prior to the 8th century before becoming a type of Anglo-Saxon derivative. Meanwhile, a simplified version, the Younger Futhark, using long branches and short twigs, gained popularity with the Danish, Swedish, and Norwegians. This second form would eventually lead to the medieval runes of the Middle Ages. Number 5. Strategic gaming. Life in the Viking period wasn't all sailing, riding, and eating boiled meats. There was downtime to be had, and when it occurred, the Vikings turned to board games. One of the most beloved tabletop strategic games of the period was Hnefatafl, a Germanic game similar to chess. It had many variants that are collectively known as the Tafl games. These games made their way across Europe, finding favor with people in Britain, Denmark, Iceland, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, and other northern and western nations on the continent. By the 12th century, though, the Tafl games had mostly been replaced by chess. However, some cultures continued playing Tafl games until the 1700s in a variant form called a tablet. The rules for tablet were written down in Latin by Swedish naturalist Linnaeus in 1732, and in 1811 they were translated into English. Today's understanding of Tafl games primarily come from this translation, which linguists and historians have found to be rife with errors. New rules have since been added to create a wholly unique form of Tafl games for modern times. Thus, we may never know just how to game like a Viking. Number 4. Women's rights. Burly men are often the main subject of imagery surrounding Viking culture. However, the women of the era played an equally important role, with perhaps more rights granted to them than even some cultures today. While they technically couldn't be Vikings, as the Old Norse term vikingar was a male-specific word, women played an intricate role in the expanse of their culture as they established settlements across Europe, Russia, and islands across the North Atlantic Ocean. At one point, it was believed that only men would set sail on raiding ventures and excursions into new lands, but recent evidence has shown that not only did Norse women join them, but they were instrumental in migration and assimilation. On the home front, Vikings followed an antiquated concept of separate spheres, with men taking the reins in matters like combat, hunting, trading, and farming, while leaving women to look after housework and raising children. However, Scandinavian women in the Viking Age were granted rights and power that other cultures during that time wouldn't have offered. This included the freedom to own property, to request a divorce, and to reclaim property after a marriage ended. Marriages in this culture were arranged, but women had a say in the arrangement and could structure the division of property by contract in the case of a divorce. If a woman were to become widowed, her command over the domestic sphere would envelop the duties of her husband, allowing her to take over his duties, such as running a family farm or trade. But in desperate times, such as when defending one's family or property, historic literature tells of shield maidens joining men on the battlefield, and their place in combat is thought to have inspired the myth of the Valkyrie. Number 3. Viking hairstyles. As displayed in pop culture with iconic characters like Marvel's Thor, one of the most enticing features of the portrayal of Vikings seems to be their long, thick manes of hair. Though today such hairstyles might be associated with environmental activists, hard rock enthusiasts, or simply those too lazy to get a hair trim, the Vikings had a very different reason to wear their hair in this way. One of the cornerstones of Viking life was practicality, and in the frigid lands of Nordic Europe, these people would take any advantage they could to weather the elements. Naturally, this included letting one's hair grow, both atop their heads and on their face. Granted, an element of laziness might be assumed from their tendency to ignore personal grooming, but this choice too came from a focus on efficiency. Such practices as braiding long strands into locks or nipping the backside of their hair to create a sort of reverse mullet were done to keep their hair from getting tangled in pieces of armor during combat. An inherent side product of this efficiency was the belief that their long hair had a direct correlation with power, a belief only strengthened by the real benefits it brought the Vikings in cold weather. Number 2. Frigid transportation. Long ships fitted with sails, oars, and carved dragons sprouting out of the bow worked well enough for transportation by sea. But how did the Vikings get around on snow and ice-covered terrain? The answer lies in many of the modern preferred methods of snow and ice travel. Items like sledges, skis, and skates have been found by archaeologists dating back to the Viking Age, and historians believe that these were necessary for Vikings to travel during the winter months, when marshes would freeze over. Hand-pulled ski sleds were thought to have been used by some Vikings for transporting animal furs, while heavier sleds were employed in hauling heavier cargo and were usually pulled by oxen or horses. Ancient skis dating back to the Bronze Age have been discovered, usually made of pine, as the natural tree resin of the wood would lubricate the underside of the planks, cutting down on friction during travel. And skates made from the foot bones of cloven animals like elk and cows were often used, though the earliest known skate was a copper-bladed version discovered in Finland dating back to 200 AD. Number 1. Barbaric behavior. While the Nordic Vikings of old were often praised for their folklore, warrior spirit, and survivalist way of life, there were many activities in which Vikings engaged that wouldn't go over so well in the modern age. As the Vikings pillaged port towns and engaged in sea raids regularly, they would capture victims and enslave them as thralls. These thralls would be sailed across Europe and either trafficked into an elaborate network or put into work on plantations. Ritualistic sacrifice and mass burials were part of Viking history as well, with the devoted people believing that such rituals were necessary to satisfy their deities.